There's something fishy about this one. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Nestled against the eastern face of Mount Meeker in central Colorado is a place called Camp St. Malo. Camp St. Malo was established officially in 1935, but it had been active as a campsite for Catholic youth for about 20 years at that point. Now, its use as a campsite began when a man by the last name of McPhee made a gentleman's agreement with the Catholic Church to allow them to use it for whatever recreational purposes they thought would serve the youth of Denver. However, in 1935, a relative of his wanted to reclaim all of those rights to the land, which of course had been given over in a verbal agreement rather than a contractual one, so that he could use it for the money. Instead, another Denver family, the Malos, decided that they were going to buy the land and gift it to the church. In thanks, the church named it after their family by naming it for the Saint Malo. Prior to that, the area was home to a number of different Native American tribes. Colorado as a whole was home to the Ute, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Shoshone, Comanche, Kiowa, Navajo, and Apache Native Americans. Of course, today only the Ute have reservations in Colorado. They've got 2 of them in the southwest corner. Camp St. Malo itself, however, was part of the Arapaho sphere of influence. It was located beneath Mount Meeker, which, along with Long's Peak, is actually considered something called the Two Guides by the Arapaho people. The Arapaho themselves spoke a Plains Algonquin language. They were a migratory group that was initially related to the same Algonquin Native Americans that you might know from the Cree, Blackfoot, Ojibwa, and the Carolina Algonquin peoples that we talked about in our Roanoke video. To this day, they speak an Algonquin language that is so endangered that it is spoken by less than 1,000 people between 2 reservations across the United States from one another. The Arapaho, of course, originated in the Great Lakes region. They weren't native to the area that is today Colorado. Instead, they were driven off by the Ojibwa. Sometime after the year 1700, they put down roots in the Colorado area before they were eventually forced to move into Wyoming and Oklahoma. Of course, like any ethnic or nationality group, they'd had their share of conflicts with other native tribes as well as the European settlers in the area. They often fought alongside the Cheyenne, Lakota, and Dakota peoples against groups like the Comanche and the Kiowa. And eventually they were forced to become their own nation within the United States itself, but not before dealing the Americans one of our biggest defeats in history at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. Another very interesting thing about the Arapaho peoples is that they have a almost Abrahamic religion, much like the Croatan from our Roanoke video. They believe in 6 days of creation with a 7th day of rest, a flood lasting 4 days and 4 nights, and a wandering figure who travels the world and eventually creates the animals and the life and all of that, before eventually sending a turtle down to find land and then drying off the continents. After conflicts with the growing United States led to the defeat of the Native American tribes, a lot of them were relocated from Colorado. This included the Ute, who were given their own reservation territory in the southwest. The Apache in Arizona, the Navajo were of course granted a large portion of Arizona and New Mexico, and the Arapaho of course were given lands in Wyoming and Oklahoma. Of course, the Arapaho had their lands changed and re-subdivided after the Battle of Little Bighorn, and Colorado became part of the United States 100 years after the country itself was founded in 1876. And this was pretty rapid. The first European settlement was actually set up by Mexican settlers in Colorado in 1851. The reason that Colorado grew so quickly and achieved statehood so fast was the gold rush. In 1858, it became a hub for gold miners and gold prospectors, and the city went from being a small town, the city of Denver specifically, went from being a small town to being a bustling hub of trade and industry. For example, in 1858, about 5,000 miners showed up in Denver every week. This massively increased the population, and today Colorado has nearly 6 million residents. For context, the surrounding states, Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma have at most 4 million people each, and at the very smallest state, Wyoming, only about 500,000. By the 1950s, Denver alone had 560,000 residents, making it slightly smaller than Wyoming, the whole state, in 2020. And among those 560,000 people were Joseph and Constance Bizup. The Bizups had one son by the name of Bobby, and Bobby was born almost completely deaf. He had been born in 1948, directly between the Second World War and the Korean War, in which his father was a master sergeant for the Air Force. And though Bobby, of course, was deaf, and this was a struggle for his family, him being the only child did make it more manageable. He did have early rudimentary Zenith brand hearing aids, and he led a fairly active life. While the majority of people couldn't understand Bobby when he talked, his parents could, and he knew sign language and could lip read very well. Bobby also absolutely loved baseball, and there's a number of pictures that are of him posing with his bat and his cousins when they visited Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania a couple of years before everything happened. One of the cousins he was visiting on that trip to Pittsburgh was Harriet Dudich, who described him as always smiling. And this made sense. At Camp St. Malo, Bobby was just as active as all the other boys. He would hike, fish, shoot, do everything everyone else could do. The camp itself was open for 6 weeks every summer. It was a sleepaway camp, open to boys 9 through 16. Stays at the camp typically lasted from Sunday evening to Saturday, and then the next batch of boys, or boys who were staying there, would come in. I will say, when reading through the list of camp activities, I am stunned that there were not more deaths and disappearances here. There are stories about children hiking up mountainsides, going off alone into the woods, and even climbing up glaciers. Of course, it was the 1950s, so parents were considerably less concerned about what their kids were getting into. And for the Bizups, it was a great opportunity to get Bobby out of the house, get him some interaction with other kids, and socialize him. That's why he had gone twice in 1957 and 3 times. This was his 3rd trip in 1958. And Bobby loved camp. He loved it here. He wrote a letter that his parents received on the 15th of August, 1958, which detailed just what a normal day looked like for him. He wrote to them that he painted a model airplane, pulled a couple of loose teeth, went for a hike, caught a chipmunk, and even received 25 cents for his teeth by the tooth fairy. And that was just one day. Unfortunately, Bobby's good experiences at camp were not going to last very long. According to news reports from the time, as well as Randy Minotaur's death in Rocky Mountain National Park, Bobby was out fishing at Cabin Creek, which is a rather long stretch of water that runs from about 12,000 feet on the eastern face of Mount Meeker down to 8,700 feet where it reaches Camp St. Malo before traveling further down the mountain. According to contemporary reports, a counselor named Terry Cowan was leading a group of boys to go fishing somewhere down Cabin Creek below the actual camp itself, so down the hill. And according to Terry, he called everybody in for dinner around 6 p.m. because this was a Catholic camp and they were quite punctual about things. They had to be back at the lodge up at the top of the hill by 6:30 for dinner. But we're already starting to find some oddities in this case, just looking at this one article from 1958 from a few days after Bobby was reported missing. For example, Terry is referred to both as Terry White and Terry Cowan in the same article. Furthermore, Cabin Creek is referred to as Cow Creek. Now, there is a nearby Horse Creek and a nearby Fawn Creek, so maybe the creeks just had different names, but then it also, articles from the time mention Cabin Creek, so it's kind of hard to figure out what was going on there. Maybe there were multiple names for the same body of water, but it's odd that they got his name both right and wrong in the same article as well. Terry told the papers that he tapped his watch to signal Bobby that it was time to go, because of course he couldn't just say to Bobby, hey, it's time to go. I mean, Bobby could read lips, so he probably could have said to Bobby, hey, let's go. But he apparently tapped his watch, Bobby nodded that he understood, and then Terry led the group of boys back up the hill, only realizing that Bobby was gone when they reached the lodge. And that's basically Bobby's disappearance story, is he was there 1 minute, and then they went up a hill, and then he was no longer there. Of course, not wanting to let Bobby get any further off than he already was, Father Richard Heister, as well as the rest of the camp staff, about 12 people in total, immediately fanned out to look for Bobby. The search itself was initially complicated by a very, very intense rainstorm, which lasted from about 7:30 to 8:30, but other than that, everyone said that the weather was pretty mild the rest of the evening, but there was a pretty heavy fog that rolled in as well. So while it didn't make it impossible to find Bobby somewhere, it did definitely dampen their chances of finding him quickly. At around 9:30, they called it into park rangers and authorities to tell them that Bobby was missing, also informing Bobby's parents. The next day, Saturday, August 16th, 1958, about 50 people went out searching. This was a mixed bag of search and rescue, National Park Service, Sheriff's Department, and volunteers, as well as camp staff. According to the Denver Post, at the time, Bobby was 80 pounds with brown eyes and blonde hair, wearing blue jeans, a cotton shirt, and a light jacket. This is what he had on when he disappeared. Now, I want you to keep in mind those specific details about what he was wearing, because they're important. By Saturday afternoon, Bobby's parents had arrived, but his mother, Constance, was so distraught at the fact that her son was missing that she actually had to be placed under the care of a doctor at the camp. It also didn't take long for the search effort to grow. You see, over at Lowry Air Force Base, Joseph was kind of a big deal. He was a master sergeant. He was in charge of quite a few people, and it seems that he was pretty well liked, because at least 200 airmen came out to help look for his son. They were also joined by the Civil Air Patrol, the search and rescue teams, a team of bloodhounds brought from California by a volunteer, as well as a Native American tracker. In case you're wondering why a soldier would go looking for Native American trackers to help find his son, in the Second World War, Navajo code talkers were instrumental parts of winning the war in the Pacific. So a lot of military members, especially World War II veterans, had pretty good relationships, had they fought in the Pacific, with the Native Americans. They respected them, they admired them, and they were more likely to, work with each other. The search party, of course, was pretty big. This is a lot of people to comb such a small area, but it was also very disorganized. They weren't working with grids, they were just kind of sending out little teams to look at anywhere that he could possibly be, checking cabins, ravines, and even draining a 10-foot swimming hole to see if he had drowned. In fact, they got so invested in trying to find Bobby that they started blowing up beaver dams just in case he was in there. And of course, you might be asking the very simple question, well, what about the creek? Maybe he drowned somewhere in the creek. It's a long creek. The creek was not deep enough for him to have drowned, and it was also not wide enough. It was basically just a little sliver in the ground. Had he been in the creek, they would have seen him. Between the searches on Friday and Saturday, nothing was found, but on Sunday the 17th, a boy who matched Bobby's description was reported in Estes Park, just 12 miles to the north. Because this seemed like a very, very good lead, it was a boy the same size, the same hair color, the same eye color, wearing a hearing aid. They figured it has to be Bobby. So the search was refocused to Estes Park, but they didn't find Bobby because it turned out that that was just another deaf 10-year-old, and his dad was there and was like, sorry, that's my kid. And of course, it did make sense for them to refocus to Estes Park. In the course of 2.5, 3 days, it made sense that a boy could travel the 10 or 12 miles that it would take to get there, depending on which trail you used. It also prompted speculation that maybe Bobby was actually avoiding rescue. Maybe he was worried he was going to be in trouble for not coming back when he was supposed to. Maybe he had gotten into a fight with somebody. Maybe there was some reason that Bobby just decided to run away. His mother told Rocky Mountain News, perhaps he thinks he will be punished. We really don't know what he's thinking. Meanwhile, the Estes Park Trail paid for thousands of flyers that all read a simple message, basically, Bobby, we miss you, come home, that were dropped from the air all over the area that he could be in, between Estes Park and the camp. But of course, as I said, eventually they figured out that wasn't Bobby. So from the jump with this case, there was a ton of confusion in general. For example, accounts differ on whether or not Bobby was with a group. Some say that Bobby was, in fact, with a group of people, and that's the reason nobody noticed, is because there were a bunch of boys, they were all heading the same direction, and just it didn't occur to anybody that Bobby wasn't part of the group. On the other hand, some of the accounts say that Bobby was alone with the counselor. It was just him and a counselor. If it was just Bobby and the counselor, that puts a lot more emphasis on the behavior of the counselor than anybody else, because how did you not notice the kid went missing when it was your only job to keep him safe? There's also the problem that the location of his fishing gear was in dispute. He had a cardboard tackle box and a fishing rod. Some reports claimed that it was on a hillside just a couple hundred yards from the camp, while others claimed it was half a mile down the trail. And as I mentioned earlier, the creek is referred to both as Cabin Creek and Cow Creek. I will say, I looked at the map, I can't find a Cow Creek. On top of all of this is the lack of success of the bloodhounds. Now, scents do stick around for a long period of time, long enough for dogs to come in weeks or even a couple of months later in some cases and still find a trail. But if the rain was heavy enough, it's possible that it dispersed Bobby's scent enough that the dogs just couldn't track him far. That maybe they had a good general idea of where he was and then lost it. They were able to track his scent to the tackle box and the fishing rod, but they were not able to track it anywhere else, and a couple days later, the Californian man with the dogs went home. It really all comes down to the violence of that storm on Friday. If it was intense enough, it could have washed away the scent. Unfortunately, on August 20th, after about 5 days of searching, it was called off. They just hadn't found anything to suggest where Bobby might be, and 5 days in the wilderness for a deaf 10-year-old alone, they were starting to think this was going to be more of a recovery mission than a rescue mission. Of course, they didn't totally abandon it. A few people did stay behind for several months, waiting just in case Bobby turned up. They also realized that they might just be driving him further away from the search area, because it was possible that Bobby was avoiding capture, and it made the most sense to just wait for him to come back of his own volition. Of course, this was heartbreaking for Bobby's family, who now had to assume that their son was dead, and nobody really knew what happened. It was so weird that Bobby just wasn't there anymore. 1 second he was fishing with the other boys, and just a few minutes later, up at the top of the hill, he was gone. Could something have captured him quietly enough? Did he run off? And after a few days, why hadn't he come back? If he was still alive, it would only make sense that he would start getting hungry and thirsty and cold and think, you know what, even if they're mad at me, I should probably still go back. You know, he was deaf, but he wasn't stupid. Furthermore, with all of this, Bobby had said multiple times he wished he could stay longer, so they considered maybe Bobby was hanging out because he didn't want to go home, and maybe he was hiding in the woods because Friday was the last day of camp, they were all going home the next day, and maybe he was trying to avoid being seen so he could stay in a place that he loved. Regardless, he wasn't found. So, even though this was a complete tragedy, the camp still opened the next year at the end of June. On July 3rd, 1959, the final day of the first week of camp that year, a man named Neil Hewitt, a young man, a seminarian, all of the counselors at camp were seminarians, by the way. They were either seminarians or they were priests. And for those who don't know, a seminarian is somebody who is studying for the priesthood. But Neil Hewitt, one of those seminarians, as well as 2 other counselors, were heading up Mount Meeker, up the eastern face, with a bunch of campers. They traveled off camp property into Rocky Mountain National Park, heading up Cabin Creek to about 11,000 feet. At that point, at that altitude, the trees start to give way to something that is more akin to boulder fields and just rocks. And because there were no longer trees everywhere, the group spotted something unusual, what appeared to be a scrap of clothing. They went and checked out the piece of clothing, and that led them to a bone, and eventually that bone was confirmed to be that of a young boy. Of course, this discovery was made on July 3rd, and it was a Friday afternoon, so they told the National Park Service on Monday. Now, the nearest ranger station was 2 miles away from Camp St. Malo, and they work on weekends, so it's a little weird that they didn't tell anybody for 3 days, but I guess we'll just move along from that. Nevertheless, the National Park Service was informed of the find of these bones on July 6th and sprang into action very quickly, launching a search the next day. And this time it would be no loose, meandering, wandering search where they were calling out for Bobby. They were going to look for bones. This was remains recovery. So they set up a grid up on the mountain, and everybody did a very careful, thorough search, which turned up quite a bit. It turned up 20 additional clothing scraps, a handful of bones, which was enough to identify, as well as a Zenith hearing aid and a red ball cap. Now, if you'll remember earlier in the video, I told you to pay attention to what they said that Bobby was wearing when he went missing. No ball cap was mentioned. I don't know what to make of that, but why would Terry leave out that detail? A red ball cap's kind of hard to miss. However, given that the rest of the clothes, as well as the hearing aid, matched those owned and worn by Bobby the day he was last seen, they didn't really need to do anything further to identify him. They were pretty positive that this was Bobby. Now, of course, at the time, you didn't have DNA. You had DNA, but you couldn't really study it. You couldn't use it to identify a body yet. So you had to do other things like chemical matching and blood typing, things like that. Now, of course, we covered how all of that worked back in the 50s when we did our video on the boy in the box, if you want to go check that out. But in this case, they basically identified him based on these are his clothes, these bones are the right size for a 10-year-old boy, and that's a hearing aid that matches the one that he wears. Now, when he was found, the Bizups were actually over in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, visiting family again. So they weren't informed immediately. They didn't find out until they got back to Denver, at which point Harriet, who went back for a visit, said that when they returned, the phone was ringing off the hook. And for everybody at the time, this kind of seemed open and shut. The cause of death was listed as exposure, and Bobby was buried in Fort Logan National Cemetery, where his dad today is buried next to him. It was just viewed as a tragic accident. A kid got spooked or freaked out or upset, ran off, got lost, and just never made it home. There was never any police investigation, even though the sheriff's department was involved in the searches. But nobody suspected foul play because there really wasn't any reason to. Everything that had been said so far, although there were a few details that didn't quite seem clear, nothing suggested foul play. Even Joseph Bizup, Bobby's father, said to the newspaper the people there did everything they could do to take care of Bobby. They simply did not think that there was any chance that somebody tried to hurt him. And when 9 News from Denver, an NBC affiliate, went to look for clues to this case back in 2019, they contacted the police and the Archdiocese of Denver, and neither of them had any records. Or they had records, just not about Bobby. And for those who don't know, an archdiocese is a level of Catholic organization. The diocese system is based off of the Roman military provinces of the imperial era, and the Roman Catholic Church took a lot of things from the Roman military, like, well, actually basically everything, and then just used it to set up their monasteries, their priesthoods, all of that, which is why you get Roman military terms like diocese in Catholic terminology. And archbishops, archdioceses, are typically located within a large civic center. So you have an Archdiocese of Philadelphia, an Archdiocese of Paris, things like that. But back to the weird stuff here. Bobby's remains were found at 11,000 feet, and they were found in a ravine tangled up in the underbrush. Keep in mind, not trees, brush. And according to contemporary reports from newspapers, that area had been searched not once, not twice, but 3 times the year prior. Also, the documentation that I found says that it was searched 3 times the previous fall. So I'm not sure if that was just a reporting error or if they actually were still looking for Bobby up in the mountains into September, October. But for over 60 years, no questions were really asked about this until 9 News launched a program by 9 Wants to Know, one of their documentary series, about the Bobby Bizup case. And the reason that they looked into Bobby was because that year there was a pretty huge scandal about abuse from Catholic priests against young boys in Colorado. That investigation led 9 News reporters to the Tucson, Arizona home of Neil Hewitt, the man who was the one who found Bobby's remains, or at least found that first bone. Hewitt had completed the seminary and went on to serve as a priest, except 2 men had credibly accused him of molesting them. So, in 1980, he left the priesthood and got married. These 2 men claimed that the abuse had happened during the 1960s, although 9 News uncovered reports of 9 victims from 1962 through 1980. Michael Schmielanek, who was one of the 2 original victims of Hewitt, the 2 that were mentioned first, said that it was a red flag that Hewitt was ever involved in the search at all. And here's where we need to go back to those contemporary accounts for a second. Because the newspapers at the time said what Terry Cowan said, that Bobby was fishing, and then they went up for dinner, and then Bobby wasn't there. This version of the story made a counselor, one of the seminarians, Terry Cowan, the last person to see Bobby alive. When reporters knocked on Neil Hewitt's door in 2019, they got a very different story. Over the course of half an hour, they grilled Hewitt about all sorts of things related to the case, and he was pretty forthcoming. He admitted to molesting those 2 boys, Schmielanek and another boy named Stort Sauka, who ended up taking his own life later on as a result of Hewitt's abuse. Hewitt went on to say that, for lack of better words, he was working the snack bar at the camp. When Bobby approached, asked to buy some candy, Neil said, "I'm sorry, you've already had too many sweets today, I can't sell you any candy." Bobby got upset and ran off. If it's true that this is the point at which Bobby ran off, it explains a lot of the gaps in the fishing story. For example, why he was found at 11,000 feet despite going missing at 8,400 feet, and he would have had to be running the opposite direction of camp, so he should have been found lower down the mountain. Towards the end of the interview, Hewitt also explicitly denied any involvement in Bobby's death, which was weird because nobody asked him. But it also seems that Hewitt was not the last person to see Bobby. I earlier mentioned Father Richard Heister, but Father Richard Heister wasn't the only Richard Heister at camp that year. He had an 11-year-old nephew who was attending. Heister, when interviewed, said, "We were all gathered at the lodge as a group. I don't really know what took place, except that at some point, this kid came running past me, kind of pushed me out of the way. He was loud, and what he was saying was unintelligible to me. This matches that it was Bobby he was talking about, because, as I mentioned earlier, other people had a very hard time understanding Bobby's speech. His parents could understand when he spoke English, but other people couldn't." And according to Heister, Bobby was in the building and ran out the front door. And Heister is almost positive. He said he is pretty sure that that is specifically the night that Bobby disappeared. He also went on to say he was really angry, pushing, and got outside of the hall. A National Park Service ranger by the name of Roger Contour corroborated that story because he said that he interviewed a bunch of the witnesses and they said the same thing about Bobby's demeanor. He was running, he seemed angry, upset, and embarrassed. And he said that this was basically a unanimous opinion from the campers, was that Bobby was upset, angry, and embarrassed. To quote Ranger Contour, "I was struck by the unanimity of all the people we talked to. Everybody said that this was a very troubled young man. Not troubled in the sense that he was generally troubled at that moment." Also, to correct myself, it wasn't upset, angry, and embarrassed. It was hurt, angry, and embarrassed, which, same thing. And then more questions arise when you consider the input of Larry Collins, a Park Service employee whose job was to clear out gooseberry and currant bushes up in the tree line around where Bobby was found because they carry a fungus that can infect the trees. Because Collins was so experienced operating at these elevations, he was assigned to the search for Bobby's remains. And he took issue with the narrative that Bobby had simply gotten lost up there. It didn't quite make sense to him. Bobby's remains were discovered 3 miles away and 2,500 feet above the camp itself. Larry said that in all his time working search and rescue and working for the parks, he'd never seen somebody get lost and keep heading uphill. To quote him, "No, as you look up that mountain, he could look back and see the camp. He could always tell where he was. Now, if he got lost in the trees. But once he got above the tree line, he could look back and see the church. You could see the camp. So what Larry's saying there is that if Bobby was alive when he reached 11,000 feet, when he reached the tree line, he could have looked down and he could have seen the camp. So if he got lost while he was in the trees, in the actual forested part. If he made it all the way to the tree line, why'd he get stuck there? Why was he still lost? He would have been able to see camp. And of course, there's the issue of, well, how would he know how to get back down? If he got lost going up, how would he not get lost going down? He could have just found the creek. The creek was easy to see. You could just go to the creek, follow it down, the creek runs into the middle of camp. Collins was also pretty confident that Bobby would have known the camp pretty well. This was the end of his 5th week there. So Collins was of the opinion that Bobby knew where he was at all times. And that is an opinion shared by Ranger Contour, that Bobby, by the time he reached 11,000 feet, by the time he was up there where they found his remains, if he was alive, he knew where he was. To quote Contour, "You don't go there. You want to go there to get away from something. Not just that. The whole location and setting just said he wanted out and he wanted to stay out. It wasn't a pleasure trip. He wanted to get away from Camp St. Malo." And this is where another little bit of information is important here. Because like I said before, Bobby's remains were found on July 3rd, 1959. The find was reported to the Rangers on July 6th, 1959. That is a full 2 days between him being found and him being reported, with hours in between. There was no legitimate reason for that delay. They could not explain why that delay happened. They could not explain what they were doing during that period, or why they didn't tell the National Park Service immediately. It just seems that they found Bobby's remains, they came down, spent the weekend kind of hanging out, and then told the National Park Service. At the same time, nothing was out of place when they found his remains. There appeared to be, bones were missing, but that's completely normal. One bone had been dragged halfway up the mountain by a small animal to be nibbled on. It didn't seem like it was a predator, it seemed like it was a scavenger, but still, it's normal for bones to go missing when somebody dies in the wild. So they didn't assume immediately that that delay meant any foul play. It was just kind of weird, and, the church couldn't explain it. I did manage to dig up the actual National Park Service report from this time, and their report says that he was on a solo fishing trip. So he was with one counselor and that was it. That differs from the newspaper account, which says it was a group fishing trip. But that's not the only detail that's given by the National Park Service report. It also gives us the details of the actual search effort and the remains finding effort. The search included helicopters and planes circling several miles around the camp, and it did not say if those planes or helicopters were equipped with infrared cameras. That technology existed, but it was not yet widespread. It also tells us that the search started on the 7th and that they moved down the mountain for about 5 or 6 miles from an elevation of 12,000 feet in a grid search. And it also gives us the information that all of the remains were found within 100 feet of that original bone, with the exception of the one that was dragged up the mountain. It also mentions that there was coyote scat in the area and that they did not find his skull. So, in 1959, the assumption was just Bobby got lost and he died. That was the official narrative from the church, from the national parks, from everybody. And for 60 years, from 1959 to 2019, nobody really thought much of it until 9 News managed to uncover and break open this huge story about clerical abuse, that 3 clergymen who worked at that camp ended up going on to abuse boys. Those priests were Neil Hewitt, Harold Robert White, who was the worst of them with over 70 victims, and Jerry Rapola, who only has 1 known victim, but he was moved around Colorado like 4 different times, and it's believed that he may have had more victims, and that's why they kept shuffling him around. This investigation by 9 News managed to lead to a full-scale national parks investigation of what happened at Camp St. Malo, an investigation which I can neither confirm nor deny is still going. I tried to find evidence, but the National Park Service isn't super public about this stuff. But Bobby is still listed on their website as a suspicious death, so it is my understanding, my assumption, that they are in fact considering this an open case still. But the flurry of media coverage surrounding these 3 priests led to something else. A guy named Tom McCloskey came forward with some riveting information after seeing the documentary on the Bobby Bizup case in December of 2020. You see, Tom had a rather strange possession that was gifted to him by his father, Dr. Joe McCloskey. The elder McCloskey had died in 1980, but before that, he had given this possession to his son, and of course he had received it from his good friend, Father Richard Heister. In case you have forgotten, Father Richard Heister was the director of Camp St. Malo in 1958 and 1959. That possession was a juvenile human skull, which Joe McCloskey told his son Tom may have belonged to a boy that went missing at camp. Tom could not recall his father's exact words, but said that it was something along those lines. And you may be wondering, why did Tom still have the skull after all this time? That's 39 years. Why did he keep the thing? Why didn't he go to the police? Well, he did spend those 40 years trying to match that skull to some sort of missing persons case. He just couldn't find the right one. And it's very likely that he didn't hand it over to police because he was worried he would become a suspect. But when he saw the 9 News documentary on Bobby Bizup, it clicked. He said, you know what, Skull, McCloskey, Richard, yeah, you know what, that makes sense. So he contacted federal law enforcement and handed over the skull, which he had just been keeping in his basement in a paper bag. When word of this got back to the younger Richard Heaster, the nephew of Father Heaster, he could not fathom why his uncle did not give the skull to police, did not give it to the parents, did not tell anybody about it, but instead just handed it over to a friend of his to be passed down to that guy's son. And it's a pretty valid question, and it's not the only one in this case. That skull changes a lot about the suspicion of foul play here. So we have a bunch of things to wrap our heads around. Of course, there's Bobby's disappearance itself, because the contemporary reports say that he went missing on a fishing trip east and downhill of camp that was either with a group or solo, depending on who you talk to. And he allegedly disappeared between 6 and 6:30 p.m. Witness testimonies, of course, didn't match this, with all of the campers saying that Bobby ran out of the lodge building, and, you know, that there's a lot more witnesses for Bobby running out of the lodge building than for Bobby going missing at the fishing site. And, of course, Bobby's location where he was found doesn't make sense if he ran off downhill. So what does this mean? Does this mean that Terry Cowan lied? Because there are two narratives of this disappearance. At the time, camp staff told the National Park Service and the volunteers investigating that he had gone missing with Terry as the only witness while fishing down the mountain. The campers, on the other hand, seem to have been unanimous that Bobby was in the building when he went missing. He ran out of the building, and that's when he disappeared, and that he looked hurt, angry, and embarrassed. And if we look at the story Neil Hewitt told investigators in 2019, it lines up a lot more with the second version than with the fishing version. But then we have to ask, if Terry did lie, why'd he lie? First of all, Bobby being solo would give investigators a reason not to question the story or look for other witnesses. And if Richard Heaster's memory is correct, that means Bobby was very, very upset about something when he went missing. What? Recall that campers did tell Contour pretty unanimously that Bobby looked they specifically used the term, embarrassed. And when you add in the detail that 3 of the priests, 3 of the seminarians at that camp went on to abuse children as priests, the picture starts to become a little bit more clear here, because let's think about Hewitt's story about the last time he saw Bobby. The way that the narrative is currently set up is Bobby tries to buy some candy, is told no, and then runs away embarrassed. I have to ask the question, is the reason that Bobby ran off upset and embarrassed from Neil's food stand because he was told no about candy? That doesn't totally match Bobby's demeanor, his description by everybody else. Or did somebody have an inappropriate encounter with him, namely Neil Hewitt? Regardless of why Bobby ran off or where he ran off from, there are more questions here. How did Bobby get to 11,000 feet on that mountain? He may have been running away and then just succumbed to exposure. But of course, this would imply, given that it was August and pretty warm up there from all accounts, it would imply that he had no survival instincts at all, because at any point he could have simply just started heading back down the mountain. If they had found him at 9,000 feet or at 10,000 feet in the trees somewhere, that would make more sense. Maybe he just got lost, couldn't find his way out, and died of hunger, cold, whatever. But where he was found is above the tree line. He could have turned around, looked down, and seen camp. There's the possibility that he was chased by wild animals, and that's why he ended up in that location. Maybe they even killed him. But there was no evidence that he had been attacked by an animal. There were just gnaw marks on that one humerus that was found further up the mountain. And that animal, whatever it was, seems to have been a scavenger, not a predator. And that leads us to the most aggressive one of all of these, which is maybe Bobby was murdered and his body was dumped up there. It makes the most sense regarding his location and the fact that he didn't seem to have tried to get back down, and that there was no evidence on the bones they found of foul play. But that's a very long way to carry an 80-pound boy, and no staff member of the camp was ever found to be guilty of murder or even accused. So the possibility that it could be murder also seems unlikely. There's no good reason why his body was up there. All of them have confusing other possibilities. And finally, what's with the skull? What is the deal with the skull? Why did Father Heaster keep the skull? And why did he give it to McCloskey? And why did McCloskey give it to his son? What was the point here? It's probably the most intriguing thing that implies foul play. It might explain why they didn't report that the body was missing for a few days. Maybe Richard Heister wanted to get up there and take a look at it and maybe take a trophy. Or maybe to prevent somebody from using it to use dental records. But even then, it was so obvious that it was Bobby that dental records wouldn't have mattered. So why did he take the skull? Personally, I think that whatever this was, I feel like the idea that somebody did something to Bobby, something inappropriate, Bobby ran out and got lost, that definitely happened, in my opinion. I don't know who did it, I don't know how he ended up at 11,000 feet, but those are the things that we seem to know about this. But, as always, I want to know what you guys think. You can let us know in the comments. And if you want to support what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can follow us on Patreon. That is just $1 a month, and it gets you some fun exclusive content, as well as access to, certain special stuff that we drop every now and then. You can also support us by buying our coffee from Tableau Roasting Company. The link is in the description. You can catch these stories and conversations live on Sunday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. But with all of that said, I'm Aiden Mattis. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.